I have made a little change in the title to discuss the topic that was proposed to you earlier in a broader context, so that we can look at this issue that is of such relevance today within this broader context. And I call it the defining battle of the 21st century, protecting freedom of conscience and religion around the world. And you will hear later that this also includes the title and the topic that you were expecting to hear today. Now you might wonder, what battle is he talking about? And where is it actually happening? And I'm very happy in this very esteemed hall to not only find members of Congress, but also many young people that are even younger than I am. I'm especially young at heart. And I'm very happy that there are so many young people here, because this is going to be the defining issue of your generation. And if you did not realize that yet today, you will hopefully have come to that conclusion after this presentation. Freedom of conscience and religion, which we might take for granted in countries like Peru, or in the country where I currently reside in Austria, or in the country where I grew up, the Netherlands, we take that for granted. But we live in times that freedom of conscience and religion cannot be taken for granted anymore. And I will explain you why. I will tell you two stories that are currently in the news. You might have read it, but I will tell these stories to you briefly. There are two stories that seemingly are distant from each other, but have a lot to do with each other. The first one is about Sir Roger Scruton. He is a respected philosopher in the United Kingdom. And he is now under vicious verbal attack from multitudes of Twitter hordes wishing him social death because he holds a range of opinions on a wide range of issues, from immigration to sexual morality to European politics, that do not conform to the mainstream expressed, which is not the same as the majority, opinion. He is deemed guilty of speech crime because he dares to question the public opinion that is expressed through the media and through social media. This is one case. And this is actually happening as we speak, because he's being barred from taking place on an important government commission for views that he holds that are not in accordance with the mainstream, although his position on that housing commission has nothing to do with these views. The other story you might have heard of. This has been in the international news, and it is the fate of Asia Bibi. Asia Bibi is a poor Catholic woman in Pakistan from a very poor area and a poor background. And she is now not only under verbal attack, as Sir Roger Scruton is, but much more, her life is in imminent danger, including the lives of her family and her lawyer, from multitudes of angry and extremely violent men in Pakistan, going on the streets, protesting and wishing her death by hanging. Why? Because she was acquitted by the Supreme Court of that country. So she was set free by the Supreme Court of that country on October 31st of wholly invented and falsified charges of blasphemy against Mohammed, dating back to the year 2009. She already spent 8 years on death row for a crime she never committed. And a crime where it is even questionable if it should be a crime. What do these two stories have in common? These two stories illustrate the threat globally against freedom of conscience and religion in a most shocking way. Because this is the reality where we stand, and there are just two examples, two small examples, of millions of such stories around the world about which most of you will probably have never heard. And that is the reason why it is so important that we discuss it today. Whether it is in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, in North America or South America, our most fundamental human right to live freely guided by our conscience and the religion that we choose or not choose is being ever more attacked and hollowed out by, as the author Brendan O'Neill calls it fittingly, a deep and instinctual intolerance, a belief of such colossal arrogance, the belief that you have the right to destroy, whether by death or social death, anyone who offends you or your belief system. And the chilling reality is that any system of institutionalized intolerance of certain groups of people in society or certain opinions in that society has always led to first totalitarianism and then mass murder. I will just give you a few examples from the history books of the 20th century. The genocide of 2 million Armenian, Greek and Assyrian Christians between 1915 and 1921 in the territory of what is today Turkey. Or the 20 million Soviet and 65 million Chinese civilians killed under communism in those countries. Or the 6 million European Jews that were killed by the Nazis. And the list goes on and is without end on all continents. But spilling into the 21st century, where we are today, there is the intensifying persecution in the Middle East, in Africa and Asia, that has already been labeled by the international community as a genocide, where it concerns the Christians and Yazidis in Iraq and Syria, killed, tortured, raped, and enslaved by ISIS and other Daesh Islamist groups since 2003. And we are still looking today at the enormous bloodshed that has been happening there and has still not come completely to an end. And as I said before, this is only part of the list. Yet all these victims have in common that their basic human right, their basic human freedom to live by their inner held convictions was denied and violently suppressed. The mere fact that they were different from the majority of those in power, or better to say, they were different from either the majority or those in power, and those deciding the narrative, made them legitimate targets. You see, the problem in society, in our human society, is always the moment that a group in society loses its voice in society, it immediately becomes the target for killing and other horrendous misdeeds. Now, what epitomized this socially or physically violent intolerance today, we can summarize that in 3 areas of laws, between parentheses, that are being passed or upheld in the parts of the world where we see those abuses of human rights, of freedom of religion and conscience. First, we have in Western countries anti-discrimination and hate speech laws that are used to silence those who do not wish to go along with what is deemed the mainstream or politically correct. Then we have the blasphemy laws. For example, in Pakistan, Asia Bibi is an example of that, but these laws are also present in many other countries, like Saudi Arabia or Iran. And there are the anti-conversion laws in some of these countries, and especially in India, in some provinces of India. That's the second group. And the third group are laws putting state control on religious congregations and excessive public order laws to control religious organizations and congregations. We, for example, see this very much in China. Now, I will come to speak about this more later on, but they all have this in common. Only one belief system is accepted, and all else has to be subjugated to that one belief system, violently or otherwise. To the ruling belief system, that is what they have in common. And this is the core of the challenge to global freedom of conscience and religion today. So let me first very briefly remind you of what is actually freedom of conscience and religion and what defines it. The right, or to say, the right to this freedom has its origin and roots in the very dignity of the human person. As the 1965 Declaration on Religious Freedom, called Dignitatis Humanae, proposed by Pope Paul VI in 1965, as this document says it, it is in accordance with their dignity as persons, that is, beings endowed with reason and free will, and therefore privileged to bear personal responsibility, that all men should be at once impelled by nature and also bound by a moral obligation to seek the truth, especially religious truth. The document goes on to explain that this includes to, once found, adhere to that truth and order one's life to it freely. Yet this requires immunity from coercion, whether this is physical, psychological, or otherwise. Any sort of coercion goes against religious freedom. And I would not like to exclude here what I call the Twitter mobs. The Twitter mobs where somebody who is not in line with what a certain group of people think should be fought, other people are immediately, violently, verbally attacked over Twitter. This is one form of a danger to freedom of conscience and religion. If people are verbally abused for expressing their inner held beliefs. Freedom of conscience and religion can only be lived when personal assent, based on free will, is at all times possible. Hence, the problem that we find in many countries in the world of not allowing people to convert to another religion. Or another problem we find in many of these countries, that they are punished for not believing in God at all. Because if we accept religious freedom and accept that we can only freely choose for God, we should also accept that there are people who freely choose not to believe in God. Even I, as a Christian, find that difficult because I am a believer. I still respect that there are people who decide not to believe, and that is as much part of religious freedom as anything else. Thus, the key to understanding and practicing this precious freedom is that since the human person has reason and a free will, its decisions on God and conscience can only be made in the innermost realms of the human heart, without any external interference. Otherwise, this fundamental freedom is no longer existent. And since as human beings we have been gifted with the ability to see reality for what it is and know it and understand the Constitution. Article 2, paragraph 3 says, "Every person has the right to freedom of conscience and religion in an individual or collective manner, and no person shall be persecuted on the basis of his ideas or beliefs. There is no crime of opinion. Public exercise of any faith is free insofar as it does not constitute an offense against morals or a disturbance of the public order." That is what the Peruvian Constitution says. And the other important document is, of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to which Peru is a signatory. It was passed in 1948, and we celebrate this year 70 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it reads in Article 18, "Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, in practice, worship, and observance," which means our freedom of religion is not limited to what happens within the church building. It also goes into education. It also goes into events like today. These are just two examples of many national and international documents where this fundamental right is enshrined. But ladies and gentlemen, I am sad to say that it is often ignored. More often than not, in many parts of the world, it is completely ignored. And it is at our own peril if we ignore this fundamental human right. Everything we hold dear in our now free societies, like Peru or Austria, where I live, is at stake. Can you name me one country in the world that does not guarantee freedom of conscience and religion, and where there is prosperity, stability, peace, and above all, integral human development? Can you name me one country that has all these aspects and where there is no freedom of religion and conscience? No, it is not possible. This is also the reason that despite all its own problems and challenges, the United States of America has been the one and the number one economic, political and military power in the world for so long. Why? Because it guarantees full freedom of conscience and religion and does not impose a religious belief system on its people or others. But also there, we already see threats on the horizon if we are not careful. So how and where, you might ask, is the freedom of conscience and religion most threatened? Because you might not realize it in your daily life. I would like to here divide it in three main ideologies that we see are threatening today our freedom of conscience and religion around the world. And these three ideologies basically cover the whole world. So you will find in one region of the world one or two of those ideologies present. The first ideology, where I will speak about the most today, and which is most dangerous, is the ideology of secular relativism. The second ideology is that of violent radicalism. And the third ideology is that of state atheism. What do these ideologies stand for? And how do they further their agendas? Let me talk a little bit with you about secular relativism. And by the way, please be reminded here in Peru and in the whole of Latin America, secular relativism, something coming from the West, mostly from Europe and Northern America, is an ideology that goes together with what Pope Francis has called ideological colonialism. It is the effort by Western countries to impose by stealth this ideology on other societies through all sorts of programs I will come to speak about. And here in Peru, in this hall of parliament, I warn you, be careful of that, because you have a rich culture in Peru that you should protect and that you should cherish, and that is a beautiful culture, and that does not need secular relativism. As I said, this is the dominant ideology in Europe, North America, Oceania, and other countries influenced by the West today. It is the intolerant attitude that stems from the idea that there is no such thing as moral truth, that everybody can decide their own truth, and that God and religion are a purely private affair that has no place in society or in the public square as a whole. For example, I just heard various of you say that here in Peru, society and also politics is informed by Christian principles. You hardly hear that in Europe these days. Most of the time, if you would say that, you will be attacked by the Twitter mobs as being intolerant. So the problem of secular relativism is that it claims that right and wrong can only be decided by majority opinion and by democratic vote, denying there is anything transcendent involved. This means that every concept becomes changeable, as long as it was voted on democratically, as long as it expresses the public opinion, or is otherwise legally binding. We call this, in legal terms, amongst lawyers, we call this legal positivism. And although few would like to admit it, legal positivism, that is a direct result of secular relativism, legal positivism led to such things, such atrocities, as the Nuremberg race laws in 1935, that were the prelude to the Holocaust of the Jews in Nazi Germany. Or legal positivism led to the far-reaching euthanasia laws in my own home country, the Netherlands, or in Belgium in recent years. And these are just a few examples. This secular relativistic concept has led to a series of serious ailments in these societies that now threaten freedom of conscience and religion in a massive way, but in a way that is often not very visible. As I said before, it is by stealth. It is by expressions of goodwill, which very often is also goodwill, but misguided goodwill. The first problem is religious illiteracy, leading to the inability to deal with its own religious history and with other cultures, in turn blinding one for the genuine and profound differences between religions. Those differences actually exist. But it is difficult to understand that when your relativistic concept says it's all the same. This renders weak and defenseless against those that have no respect for one's culture, whether within the society or coming from outside of the society. We see this problem in Europe today. I'll give you that example. Indigenous Europeans, ignoring and often rejecting their own culture and Judeo-Christian heritage, whilst holding all religions as basically having the same concept and worth, have become largely blind and oblivious to the fact that the Muslim religion understands itself and its mission radically different. I'm sure you're aware that in Europe in the last decades, we have had a very large immigration of Muslims from other parts of the world. This in turn, this religious illiteracy and this failing to understand the differences between religions, this in turn leads to the void which is left by Europeans themselves to be filled by others who have fundamentally different ideas about society. And let me warn you, whether that is other religions or homegrown ideologies. So the void is not only filled by other religions or belief systems that come in from the outside, but the void is also filled by homegrown ideologies. That's the first problem of the secular relativism. The second one is that the rule of law is being undermined. And I call it the rule of law is being replaced by the rule of feelings. Since Western society no longer recognizes that there is an objective moral truth that people can actually understand by reason, and denies any form of transcendence of the human being, it can thus no longer base the workings of its society on anything else than what is in fashion or feeling today, as there is no objective reality of truth. We see this in the sheer speed with which once unthinkable practices like eugenic abortions, for which we rightfully condemned the Nazis, and this is happening today, these eugenic abortions. It's happening all over the world, but in Europe in a specifically extreme way. Recently, the country of Iceland in Europe proudly proclaimed that it was Down syndrome free because it aborts 100% of unborn children diagnosed with Down syndrome. That is eugenic abortion. And most other European countries are much the same. This is one of those developments that were unthinkable a few decades ago. Another one is euthanasia on young children. That is increasingly happening in North America and in Europe. Or the whole gender ideology spectrum of limitless sexual expression forms that have not only become acceptable, but also the latter increasingly becoming a so-called minority of human right that is pitted above all other human rights. And it has become a new orthodoxy that one is not allowed to question anymore. Once the human being rejects its transcendent nature and it being bound to the laws of nature, it turns itself into a god. And then everything becomes possible, as long as one has the power to do so. Now, I want to give you an example here, in case you don't understand what I mean by the laws of nature or by the transcendence of the human being. If I were to go into this hall and grab one of your phones and say, "This is now mine," you would all rise up in horror and say, "You can't do that." And then I would say, "Well, why cannot I do that?" Because you say, "It's against the law. You cannot steal." And then I would say, "Well, on what is that law based?" You would say, "The parliament has passed that." I say, "Why did the parliament pass that?" Let's take it differently. If there were no law against theft, and I would do the same thing, would it then be right? And you would all say, "No, of course not." Yeah? Because theft is wrong. So if it's not in the law, why is it wrong then? Because we all know by our nature as human beings that stealing is wrong. It's as simple as that. That is what we mean by the laws of nature. That is what we mean by the transcendence of the human being, because we know we are bound to a higher law than ourselves. We know that we are bound to a higher law, that even if it's not written into a law in a parliament, it is still something that we cannot do, and that counts for many other things. And this concept is exactly what is being rejected by secular relativism, because it says basically only those things that we agree in law are wrong are wrong. And already the famous agnostic, by the way, philosopher Hannah Arendt recognized this problem in 1946 in her book The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she wrote something very interesting. I've read it many times, and every time I read it, I am struck by its relevance today. It was written over 70 years ago. She says, "A conception of law which identifies what is right with the notion of what is good for the individual or the family or the people or the largest number, becomes inevitable once the absolute and transcendent measurements of religion or the law of nature have lost their authority. And this predicament is by no means solved if the unit to which the good for applies is as large as mankind itself. For it is quite conceivable, and even within the realm of practical political possibilities, that one fine day, a highly organized and mechanized humanity will conclude quite democratically, namely by majority decision, that for humanity as a whole, it would be better to liquidate certain parts thereof. Here, in the problems of factual reality, we are confronted with one of the oldest perplexities of political philosophy, which could remain undetected only as long as a stable Christian theology provided the framework for all political and philosophical problems, but which long ago caused Plato to say, "Not man, but a God must be the measure of all things." Well, this very concrete analysis that she gives, we saw that, for example, in the example I just gave you of Iceland. By majority decision, it was decided that unborn children with Down syndrome should be exterminated. Period. That was it. Secular relativism both weakens our ability to defend freedom of conscience and religion, whilst at the same time imposing a new religion, a new orthodoxy, which interestingly claims as an absolute that there is no absolute. Now listen to that again. Secular relativism claims as an absolute that there is no absolute, which is a contradiction in itself. And as a result, eventually it destroys the rule of law and replaces it by a system of law based on feelings, preferences, opinions, choice, another very popular word. And through power, it ultimately leads to a totalitarianism that tolerates no other system of thought than its own. Again, in the words of Brendan O'Neill, we are witnessing an ethical cleansing of public life, an attempt to expunge the public sphere of anything deemed wrong think. Now, the way in which secular relativism furthers its agenda is through education, policies, law, social media, and a lot of propaganda. I'll give you some very brief examples. In education, and this has also happened in Peru, we see the phenomenon of what is called comprehensive sexual education. I would rather like to call it comprehensive sexualization of our children. It is about trying to change the minds of young people, young children, trying to change their minds, or better to say, changing what is human in them into believing that certain things that we human beings are born with are actually to be ignored. And there's a whole ideology behind that in which I will not go now. But education is really used to promote that message of we have to try everything out. Another area is the law, of course. We have anti-discrimination and hate speech laws that now in certain countries forbid us to say or write things that we deemed basic human features since creation. For example, that there are indeed two sexes, male and female, and that they are complementary and not the same, and that they can also not be made the same, that they are meant to be different, and that that is a good thing. There are countries, there are parts of countries where it is forbidden to teach such a thing because it is called discrimination. Social media is another area. I already spoke about that. Twitter storms and other public shaming of those that are not willing to accept the new orthodoxy. Where is the tolerance that is being preached? That we have an open debate about such things. The two other ideologies threatening our freedom of conscience and religion globally, I will only discuss briefly, because you should already know something about it by reading the news. Because as I said, the first ideology comes in stealth. The other two are written about. The second one is violent radicalism, as I spoke about. And this is expressed most clearly in two distinct ideologies that we see on the world scene today. One is radical Islamism, which we find not only in Muslim majority countries, but also in Western countries with Muslim populations. Another ideology is Hindu nationalism, which is on the rise in certain parts of India. And it has become very prominent lately, and deadly also. Especially it affects Christians and also Muslims in India. Both of these violent ideologies, so radical Islamism and Hindu nationalism, are willing to kill and rape for the sake of excluding and annihilating any religion and norms that are not their own. In the Middle East, we have seen a persecution and genocide unfold since 2003 in Iraq, Syria, and in Egypt, whereas Iran and Saudi Arabia have never known religious freedom at all in their whole histories. In these societies, being a Christian or a Yazidi means being a second-rank civilian, if granted any rights at all. It is, however, and this is what I want to point out to you, the same deep and instinctual intolerance as already discussed before. Anyone who thinks differently is to be expelled from public life, from society, from the country. And we saw that, and we see that today with the case of Asia Bibi. Blasphemy laws are used to persecute those that are thinking differently. In Pakistan, we know that by far the majority of the cases of blasphemy prosecutions are against Christians and other minorities in that country. Apart from Asia Bibi, there are 40 other people in Pakistan that are imprisoned because of that, simply because those laws are used against those who have another religion or belief. But those blasphemy laws are also in power in other countries. They are used as a legal weapon, as are so-called anti-conversion laws that we also see in India. I now come to the third ideology that threatens our freedom of conscience and religion. And that is, especially in Asia, we see that. State atheism. This ideology, found in countries like China and North Korea, works the same as the previous two, especially also with state-sponsored violence and incarceration to forbid or control anything religious and force adherence to the official ideology of the supreme state or of the party. For example, in North Korea, 200,000 Christians languish in forced labor and prison camps simply because they are Christians. They are deemed a political risk. In China, the regime under the current president has in recent times been destroying hundreds of Christian churches that refuse to come under state control. Under state atheism, freedom of conscience and religion is considered a danger because it cannot exist as belief in a God, because belief in a God always supersedes the human-built state. And this is something those promoting state atheism cannot accept. We see it mostly enforced by relentless propaganda and discrimination policies against those that do not live by the state and party ideology. We saw that very clearly in Europe, in Eastern Europe, in the times before the fall of the Iron Curtain, and in the Soviet Union. People who were expressed Christians and didn't toe to the official state atheist line would not have much chances at university or on the job market. It is also enforced by strict and often brutal enforcement of laws that control and curtail churches in all aspects of their operations. In China, for example, all churches have to submit to a state-controlled organ or otherwise go underground and see their churches closed and demolished and their priests and bishops imprisoned. What should be done? I come to my third part. What should be done to better protect freedom of conscience and religion today? The first one It's the most important one. Be informed. Raise awareness by exposing abuses and overcome religious illiteracy. I am always shocked to see how little university students and how little politicians and policymakers in general know about the many countries in the world where freedom of conscience and religion is either non-existent or under great threat. And they are also most often not aware of the dangers in their own countries where it comes to the ideology of secular relativism and what that is causing. We all have to be much better informed and educate ourselves and others, whilst forcing our generally biased media and institutions, especially international institutions, to really dedicate sustained coverage and effort to combat the massive abuse of this fundamental right around the globe today. And as I'm in a parliament building here, especially parliaments should name and shame governments and groups that trample on religious freedom. If only we would speak more about it in public, if only we would expose it more in public, and a real debate would come. So much good could be done through that by simply creating awareness. I will give you an example of how one can work, and I've been involved in that. In 2016, I organized with the International Catholic Legislators Network that was mentioned before, a summit of patriarchs and parliamentarians. Patriarchs are leaders of Christian churches in the Middle East. And we brought those politicians and patriarchs, church leaders together. And for 4 days they were together on one location and they shared information and experiences. This then led to a series of developments. One of them being that in the months that followed that, many countries, starting by the way with Argentina, then the United States, the United Kingdom, the EU, and other legislatures, passing a resolution that called the persecution of the Christians and the Yazidis that was happening in the Middle East, that called it genocide, and that called upon the international community to take action. Another example is that only recently, in the past week, a group of up to 200 parliamentarians from around the world has written to the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, to call upon his government to respect its own Supreme Court ruling and allow Asia Bibi to leave the country so she can be safe from the mobs and enjoy her religious freedom. And over the years, we have brought together religious leaders from around the world with politicians from around the world, setting up bilateral meetings and allowing them to share information and for the politicians to become aware of the abuses of religious freedom. Standing here in this parliamentary hall, in this great building, so to say, the beating heart of Peru, this is what all parliaments should be doing. Engage with religious leaders. Engage with the persecuted churches. Engage yourself with the ideologies that are threatening on all levels our freedom of conscience and religion. Governments should ensure through formation programs that their diplomats are well versed in their knowledge of religion. Despite the Western-driven secular relativism, still far over 80% of the world population strongly identifies itself with God and religion. It is simply irresponsible to ignore this reality for ideological reasons. Then another thing that should be done by parliaments around the world is to adapt or create laws, resolutions, or policies that defend freedom of religion and conscience and expose abuses and help victims. Parliaments can do much more than its members often think. I already gave you some examples, but let me add some short additional examples. A parliament can ask its government to impose travel bans against individuals, whether state actors or others, who are engaged in abusing these fundamental human rights. Bilateral economic sanctions can be imposed. If your country has trading relations with another country that is abusing this human right, bilateral economic sanctions can be imposed. You don't need to wait for the international community to do something. Bilateral diplomatic sanctions. Call the ambassador of that country to your foreign ministry. Cutting financial aid projects. This is, for example, what we think the United States should do with Pakistan. It should cut financial aid projects until this country guarantees that it abides even by the ruling of its own Supreme Court on religious freedom. Reconstruction projects in afflicted areas. In this regard, one country is a real example. It's the country of Hungary. Hungary has set up a program which is called Hungary Helps, and it is actually directly helping with the reconstruction of destroyed villages in the Middle East, villages that were destroyed in a genocide against the Christians and the Yazidis. Scholarships for young people from persecuted groups. Again, the Hungarian government has set up a program through which it invites young students from countries where Christians or other religious groups are being persecuted to come and study in their country and then return to their country. Humanitarian asylum in cases where people's lives are in danger. For example, my country, the Netherlands, extended humanitarian asylum to the lawyer of Asia Bibi because his life was being threatened as well, and he is in the Netherlands. But also UN institutions should get involved. You should activate the UN institutions. The UN Security Council, for example, recently met to condemn what is now slowly being called the persecution and possibly even genocide that is happening against the Rohingya population in Myanmar. This is a population consisting mostly of Muslims. The United Nations Security Council condemned that. In concluding, why is the protection of freedom of conscience and religion the defining battle of the 21st century? Why is that so? The great English statesman Winston Churchill famously said that those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it. Those that do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it. We should take these words to heart today, because where it concerns freedom of conscience and religion, history is already repeating itself in a very chilling way. One example is what I called out before, the genocide against mostly Christians that has taken place in Iraq and Syria in recent years. On mostly the same territory, with the same rhetoric being used, and with the same methods being used as 100 years ago. And with world powers once again, and international organizations as well, first looking the other way out of political expediency, and then only too late speaking up, exposing and acting, if at all. And here, ladies and gentlemen, we see how violent radicalism and secular relativism are dangerous a dangerous combination of political forces on the world stage. Of course, they don't cooperate with each other, but the mere presence of these two ideologies on the world stage leads to real serious problems. I would once again like to give you the example of Asia Bibi. She is being persecuted for her Christian faith in a country where violent radicalism rules the streets. But not much is being done. Yes, I know that some countries are trying to work behind the scenes, but it's not amounted to much yet. Not much is being done by the powers that be in the Western countries to actually get a breakthrough in that situation and to actually have Asia Bibi freed from, she is officially not in prison, but she's being kept at a secure location for her own safety, because she would not be safe on the streets of Pakistan. So here you see those two ideologies that their mere presence is actually undermining freedom of conscience and religion. So, in concluding, since we live in a globalized and deeply interconnected world, what is at stake here is peace, prosperity, and progress. And we need to protect our freedom of conscience and religion at all cost, because it is the foundation of the rule of law and the democratic society that many of our countries have fought for with so much pain and tears and blood, including your own country. How much have you fought for the rule of law and the democratic society? Not secular relativism, not violent radicalism, and not state atheism should be allowed to undermine this foundation. It is, ladies and gentlemen, members of Congress and the many young people in this room, it is in your hands as university students, as those in careers, as legislators, policymakers. It is in your hands for the sake of humanity. God bless you, and God bless the nation of Peru. Thank you.
Gracias a usted. Fue la exposición del doctor Christiaan Altin von Geusau. A continuación tenemos los comentarios a cargo del doctor Martín Santibáñez Vivanco, decano de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad San Ignacio de Loyola.
Muchas gracias. Buenas noches. Con la venia de los excelentísimos congresistas, querido profesor Christiaan Altin, damas y caballeros. En primer lugar, yo quiero agradecer al profesor Christiaan Altin von Geusau porque ha cruzado el océano para estar con nosotros por solo 3 días en una agenda muy apretada, dentro de una agenda anual que él tiene mucho más apretada, ya que es un conferencista de nivel internacional, un gran organizador de parlamentarios católicos, y ahora nos contaba que también evangélicos en todo el mundo, un gran pensador, un hombre de universidad que tiene muchísimos emprendimientos. Ha hecho un paréntesis en su agenda para venir a Latinoamérica, conocer por primera vez el país, estar en nuestro Perú y compartir con nosotros en 2 conferencias. Una hemos querido que sea aquí en el Congreso de la República, que como él bien ha dicho es el corazón del Perú. Aquí está representado todo el Perú. Todos los segmentos del Perú están en el Parlamento. Y otra en el lugar natural a donde pertenece un catedrático, que es la universidad. Por la mañana estuvo en la universidad y fue incorporado como profesor honorario al claustro de profesores de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad San Ignacio de Loyola. Querido profesor Altin, la semilla que has sembrado en estos 2 días, créeme, va a fructificar. Este primer viaje que has hecho a Sudamérica, al Perú, esta semilla que dejas en tierra peruana, cae en tierra buena, va a fructificar. En unos años, en pocos años, verás el fruto de tu esfuerzo intelectual reflejado no solo en los países en los que trabajas normalmente, en Europa, en Estados Unidos, en África, sino también en el Perú. Eso yo lo veo y te agradezco por eso, porque has venido como un sembrador de paz, como un intelectual que nos trae unas ideas sugerentes y potentes para interpelarnos ante la grave crisis que atraviesa nuestro país y el mundo también. En segundo término, yo quiero agradecerle a los congresistas que el día de hoy nos acompañan. No se imaginan ustedes el orgullo y la felicidad que siento cuando veo que congresistas de diversas bancadas, sin importar sus divisiones ideológicas o políticas, todas coyunturales, se unen el día de hoy para escuchar a un hombre que viene a hablarnos de unidad. El Perú solo se salvará a través de la unidad espiritual que nos fundó y de la unidad política que nos tiene que dirigir en el futuro más cercano. Esto es fundamental. Por encima de los partidos está el Perú. Por encima de las divisiones ideológicas está el Perú. Por encima del pensamiento distinto siempre está el Perú. Yo les agradezco a todos ustedes, queridos congresistas, porque han venido el día de hoy a acompañarnos y a presentar al profesor Altin von Geusau. Y por último, quiero señalar la importancia histórica, trascendente, desde el punto de vista no solo político, sino académico, de que aquí, en el corazón de la República, en el Parlamento peruano, se hable de Dios y del cristianismo. Mi maestro, Rafael Domingo, que hace muchos años vive en Estados Unidos, me enseñó que las sociedades modernas, vinculadas al relativismo posmoderno, quieren construir un nuevo orden mundial, et si Deus non daretur, como si Dios no existiera. El fruto de ese intento voluntarista es la violencia, la destrucción del orden político. El fruto de construir una comunidad política sin Dios es la destrucción del Estado de Derecho. Y lo vemos en estos días, lo vemos en estos meses en el Perú. Muy bien. ¿Por qué no construimos una sociedad et si Deus daretur, como si Dios existiese? Partiendo de esa premisa. Si algo fundó el Perú, fue el cristianismo. La Iglesia Católica está en la raíz, en el origen de la peruanidad. El cristianismo nos ha mantenido unidos por siglos. Y la única forma de regenerar a la República es acudiendo nuevamente a las raíces que fundaron la peruanidad, a las raíces que nutrieron a este país. Et si Deus daretur. Queridos amigos, muchas gracias porque nos han acompañado el día de hoy en esta conferencia internacional histórica, en donde hemos hablado de los problemas del mundo, pero también hemos hablado de Dios en el Congreso. Eso no debe asustarnos, eso debe animarnos, porque la mayor parte de este país no solo cree que Dios debe estar presente en el Congreso, sino también en la esfera pública. Así nos lo pidió el Papa Benedicto XVI. Jóvenes, universitarios, políticos, intervengan ustedes en el diálogo de nuestro tiempo. Esta conferencia internacional ha sido una manera, un grano de arena, una pequeña semilla para nuestro país en ese orden, intervenir en el diálogo de nuestro tiempo. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias. Fueron los comentarios del doctor Martín Santibáñez Vivanco, decano de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad San Ignacio de Loyola. Tiene razón el autor en decir, sin mí nada podéis hacer, dice el Señor. A continuación tenemos las palabras de clausura y entrega de placa recordatoria a cargo del señor congresista de la República, Juan Carlos González Ardiles.
Gracias. Muchas gracias nuevamente a nuestros invitados, doctor Altin, amigos congresistas, Martín, y a todos ustedes, muchísimas gracias. Escuchaba con atención al profesor Altin, de verdad que I speak louder, sorry. Escuchaba con atención, en realidad, imagínense, hablar de Dios en el Congreso de la República del Perú es para nosotros un gran reto. Les explico por qué. Porque a nosotros, estaba leyendo lo que dice ahí, miren, ante posibles actos de discriminación. A nosotros nos discriminan no por posibles. Todo lo que hacemos nosotros es malo. O sea, hablamos de Dios, es malo. Cometemos un error, pero ¿cómo? Si este hombre es un hombre de Dios, ¿cómo hace esto, no? Yo hice un comentario sobre una situación política y me dijeron, oye, hipócrita. Me sacaron en el diario, hipócrita. Usted habla de Dios y no se comporta como cristiano. Cualquier error que cometemos nosotros está allí no mirando nuestro corazón, sino cualquier error que cometemos. Pero en realidad hay algo que forma parte de nuestra formación, es un versículo bíblico que dice, separados de mí, nada podéis hacer. Separados de Dios no vamos a poder hacer nada, ¿no? Y recordaba también, escuchando al profesor Altin y a Martín, a Paloma y al congresista Paloma Nocé, al congresista Luis Galarreta, de que en nuestro himno, en el himno nacional del Perú, que nos emocionamos tanto en cantar, en 3 oportunidades dice el Dios de Jacob, ¿no? O sea, muchas de las personas que cantan el himno nacional, que reniegan, no saben que en el himno está 3 veces el Dios de Jacob, el Dios de Jacob y el Dios de Jacob. Así que yo creo que el Perú, a pesar de los problemas que estamos viviendo, siempre somos unos convencidos de que la familia debe estar en el centro de las políticas públicas. Y nosotros todos que hemos coincidido en esta mesa tenemos esa premisa, que no vamos a descansar un segundo de nuestro tiempo como congresistas y también como personas que tenemos una familia, de trabajar para que esta política pública sea realmente en beneficio de todos los peruanos. Profesor Altin, muchísimas gracias. Como muy bien decía Martín, usted ha venido desde Europa a nuestro país. Muchas gracias. Yo sí también soy un convencido de que lo que usted ha sembrado se va a cosechar, porque dice algo que usted habló muy sabiamente. La palabra de Dios nunca regresa vacía. Siempre cumple un propósito, ¿no? Y esa palabra que usted ha sembrado la va a cosechar también. Así que en nombre del Perú, en nombre de mis amigos, de mis colegas congresistas, en nombre de todo el Congreso de la República, en nombre del presidente del Congreso de la República, en nombre de todas estas familias peruanas, muchísimas gracias. Dios lo bendiga, se quede en nuestro corazón, y un abrazo para usted, para su familia y para toda su nación. Muchísimas gracias.